All right, moving along. Next up, we are going to hear about clinical trials, and I would like to welcome our speaker, Amin Yakubov, who is a program coordinator and part of the clinical trials office here at Perlmutter Cancer Center and Bellevue Hospital Center. So let's welcome Amin.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amin Yakubov, and I'm the program coordinator at the clinical trials office at NYU. So this was a really great segue to talk about clinical trials. So what are clinical trials? Clinical trials are research studies that people volunteer in to be a part of to test new drugs, devices, or techniques. Physicians need them to learn whether a new treatment works and if the treatment is safe for their patients. All new treatments must go through clinical trials before being approved by the FDA for regular use, so they're very important. What do we learn from clinical trials? So there are two very important things that we learn. Are they safe and are they effective? Is the treatment safe? All treatments come with a risk, of course. However, what we try to determine in clinical trials is if are the benefits outweighing the actual risk of the particular clinical trial that the patient is participating in. And are the clinical trial that a patient is participating in, is it effective? Does this treatment work well? How well does it work? Does it apply to all groups, or does it apply to certain groups? What are the side effects? So how are clinical trials conducted? So it takes quite some time to conduct a clinical trial, but before a clinical trial even begins, we have to have some preclinical studies. And that's a point where researchers, scientists, and clinicians actually study a disease state in the lab where they're doing a lot of research for quite some time. And during that time, when they identify a disease, they begin to do it on a cellular level. They test drugs on a cellular level. Then they begin to test drugs maybe on animal studies. And once they get appropriate results, they begin to submit to an FDA approval. And if they get an FDA approval, they can begin doing clinical trials on humans. And there are multiple phases in clinical trials. So we first begin with the initial phases where we recruit a small amount of population, and we really look closely into the effectiveness of a drug and also the safety. And then as time progresses and we look at the data closely, we open it up to multiple phases, and in the end we get to phase 4 where we're advertising to a larger population to ensure that we're hitting all subpopulations as well. And if our data shows to be very strong, and if the drug is safe and effective, we could begin to get FDA approval. So how do we ensure safety? So there's a few ways that we ensure safety when we're conducting clinical trials. The first thing that we have is the PRMS, which is the Protocol Review and Monitoring System. It's mandated actually by the National Cancer Institute, and it's a committee of peers, physicians, scientists, researchers that review and assess the study plan and to make sure that it's actually scientifically sound. And there's also a review that happens annually. We also have the Data and Safety Monitoring Committee. So every clinical trial is required to have a plan to monitor the side effects. So when a participant is on a clinical trial and they enter and they have the visits with their physicians, if there are any side effects, we have to report to the DSMC, and they measure the events and also ensure that we're conducting studies with quality. Lastly, we also have the Institutional Review Board. So NYU has their own specific IRB. And the IRB is not only for clinical trials, but it's actually for all research studies that are occurring at NYU. And their main focus is to ensure that we're conducting safe and ethical clinical trials. And furthermore, their concern is that are we providing the benefits, and are the benefits of the clinical trial that we're providing outweighing the actual risk of these clinical trials? Do we provide respect for all persons? When it refers to clinical trials, are we providing the right consent? And is that consent accurately written? Do patients actually understand what kind of clinical trial they're participating in? And of course, justice. The IRB wants to make sure that we're doing our clinical trials in an ethical way and that we're hitting all populations and we're serving all of our community. It's composed of a community of people, experts, physicians, and community members, and we do have annual reviews. And before a clinical trial even opens, they have to go through an IRB review. So why do clinical trials take so long? So there are many, many barriers for clinical trials. However, one of the biggest barriers is that only only 5% of adults diagnosed with cancer actually participate in clinical trials. And that being is because they're not, people don't really know that clinical trials are available to them at their institution. There's also discomfort with being a volunteer, and patients also worry about being harmed by an unproven treatment. There are very strong, stringent eligibility criteria to even enroll in a clinical trial, and clinical trials are costly. Some terminology to know when a patient is actually enrolled on a clinical trial. There's this concept of randomization. So it's a random assignment to either the treatment or the control group, like a flip of a coin. And control group could be many things. It could be a placebo, which is an inactive drug, or it could actually be standard of care versus a new treatment option. And then there's also these terminologies, blind and double blind. Blinded studies are when patients don't know if they're on the control group or the new treatment option, or the double blind where both physicians and patients both don't know which arm of the trial the patient is on. So at the Perlmutter Cancer Center, we have over 150 cancer trials open and available to our patients at any time, and more are growing. Of those 150, 16 are breast cancer studies, and 5 more are planning to open very soon. The clinical trials are available at the Cancer Center, at Bellevue, and we're trying to expand that even more on Long Island, and we also are planning to expand trials at other boroughs. Some great resources to have to do some research on your own are the clinicaltrials.gov website, and that website is really resourceful where you could actually search for clinical trials on a national level, by disease state. You could search for clinical trials regionally or even by institution, and it gives you a lot of information on particular trials. The NYU website also has a search option for clinical trials where you could search by the available trials at NYU. And lastly, as a really good takeaway message, always ask your physician about clinical trials. Empower yourself and empower to understand your health. And when it comes to cancer, there are many options that may be available to you, and one of them can be clinical trials as well. Thank you.